Hello, class. So for this week, we're talking about physical and spiritual well-being. And there are three things that I'd like for you to get from this as our objectives. One, to discover how uh, health opens up to prayer. How does praying help you? Two, to examine the characteristics of an emotionally healthy person. And three, we're going to discuss some uh, what is health from a blanket definition to see how you can understand it. So, the World Health Organization defines health uh, as a complete sense of a mental and spiritual and physical state, and not just the absence of disease. So a lot of times people think that, hey, because I'm healthy, I don't have a disease, that I am in good health. Well, looking at that definition of it, you're looking at a mental, a physical, and a spiritual component. So if one of those components is not there, then according to the World Health Organization, we're not really dealing with a quote unquote healthy person. And so as we talk about, psychological and spiritual well-being, I'm also going to throw an extra word in there. And the other word I'm going to throw in there is emotional. Because I believe that all three of these things is what makes us happen. You know people that you look at them and you say, you know what, this person's an emotional train wreck, or they're emotionally unstable, or with the young people in this day and they say, they a little cray cray, because you think that all the gears are not necessarily working, in their minds. But this is a different concept when it comes to wellness, because we're looking at different measures. And so as we look at all these different measures, the first one that I wanted to look at is mood. So as we look at all of these different components, wrap this around the word mood. How are you feeling today? And looking at moods according to sexes, there are differences even between men and women when we talk about moods. Um, when men are in certain moods, they look for distractions. Let me go fishing, or let me go hiking, or let me go hunting, or let me jump on, you know, listening to music, or something that will distract them from the moment. Where women seek to communicate with someone about this event. And so you're dealing with the men versus men are from Mars, women are from Venus, type of uh, situation. When it comes to physical and emotional and all of this well-being, that we wrap together. Now, you also know people who are just in bad moods all the time. It's how they live. They live in that state of negative. They live in that state of there's never anything right. They live in that world of the glass is always half empty, instead of us looking at it being half full. There are people who can't identify or solve problems effectively or efficiently. So these are people who are just very unstable and unbalanced, because they have not been able to cope with those moods and the emotions that come along with them. So, looking at personal health, when we look at our personal health, what is it that we're looking for? Obviously, for every person, it is a quest to live and lead a fulfilling life. So there are two things that come into play with this. You're looking at an emotional state, you're looking at a mental state. So when we look at a mental state, we're looking at a person and how do they have compassion, for someone? How do they look at their fellow man? Being unselfish, how do they treat their fellow man? Having a sense of meaning, what is it that is inside of that intrinsic quality that you wish to have? adapting to situations. How flexible are you when it comes to dealing with difficult situations, or even being able to compromise when you know that the avenue in which you're thinking may not always be the best avenue, but there might be another way that this can be accomplished if you're willing to say, hey, my way may not be the best way, so let's adapt and be a lot more flexible and amenable, to different situations. And last but not least, having control over mind and body. We often look at health as being that mind over matter, what most people would say. But yes, it is a mind and body experience that encompasses this whole definition of being. And so when we look at these situations, we look at IQs and EQs. And I'm going to throw another Q in there called a SQ. And we'll talk about the SQ a little bit later. But first, let's talk about IQ, your intelligence quotient, based on achievement. That's what society says. And you heard about the Mensa Society for the people that have the super high, IQs. And, back in the day, it was if you have an IQ that is very high, you're going to be one of the more successful people in America, or you'll be able to get the best job or have the best opportunities because you have this high IQ. The other thing is psychologists looked at this IQ and said, that may not be the best measure, of determining success for a person or their abilities. So they came up with something called EQ, and emotional quotient. And so now this emotional quotient monitors emotions to guide thinking and action. So now they're saying if you have a higher EQ, then you will have better job performance. Your home will be more stable, more happier, because basically they're saying you are a more rational type of thinker. And so when we wrap all of those things together into that concept, it does make us think a little bit. When we think about how does our IQs and EQs come into play, and more important, that emotional quotient, how high or low is it? How do you gauge it? And so when you deal with those types of quantitative numbers, it puts you in a scale. And so sometimes when it puts you in a scale, it puts you in a box. And so for us, it's trying to figure out which way should that box lie, or should we even have that box to start with in the first place? But that is the question that we ask. So once we look at this EQ and IQ, we look at self-esteem. How do you feel about yourself? Do you feel good? Do you feel bad? Do you have a high? Now, is your self-esteem too high where you're floating in outer space? Is your IQ really low where you feel like everyone's walking on top of you? Or is that self-esteem somewhere close to the middle? But at the end of the day, it's all about how do you feel about you? How much do you love you? And you hear people like, man, I love me some me, because they only look at it from that lens. But they're not wrong in that concept, because yes, you have to have a love for yourself, but then that I love me some me can almost be borderline on a narcissistic, type of attitude, which is in effect unhealthy from a behavioral, standpoint. But self-esteem means that you know yourself. When I look at myself, I know what, your faults, I know my achievements, I know my good points, my bad points. You know these triggers, knowing yourself. It's almost like the old quotes, in literature, to thine own self be true. Well, you can only be true to yourself when you know yourself. And so the second thing is, when it comes to self-esteem, is meeting your personal needs. A lot of people, their self-esteem is based on, man, my career objectives, or the amount of money I have in the bank, or the kind of car that I drive. So some things are based on academic achievement. You're a loser because you didn't get through this, or you couldn't achieve, a certain degree or job, based on your esteem is high, because of the kind of car you drive, or the kind of clothes you wear. Or it could simply be, man, I don't got a lot of money. And so a lot of these things drives that esteem and those emotional responses that come from it, that also play a role in your physical health. Now, the last one is the pursuit of happiness. Are you happy on your path? And it was almost familiar to the movie with Will Smith, The Pursuit of Happiness. And he was that person who sold machines. He was an inventor, but he was wanting to get this job that seemed to be so far out of reach to him. But the more that he looked and the more that he wanted to do this, he knew he had to do it, not only for himself, but because of his son. Was it a very prideful moment for him? Yes, because he lived in a shelter until he got that job. So all about that feeling of worth. What does it get to you? How does it make you feel? And so you also have a social health. How do you connect with your neighbor or your family or your friends or your coworkers? How do we deal with one another from a social health standpoint? Once again, similar to self-esteem, this is an internal drawing, to see how do you endure when you have challenges, when you have difficult situations. Do you dig deep to try to take care of these things, or do you let them control you? That social health looks at your mental capacity. How do you weigh the pros and cons about the decisions that you make? And then how do you feel about the control that you have over your own life? So when we deal with this social health, you also have social problems. You have social isolation. People who have few social contacts. A lot of times you would call them those social butterflies, or more like that old Imelda Marcos, who really, Leona Hemsley, who really did not have a lot of people around her, who lived in almost that type of isolation inside of a bubble. It could also be a case of loneliness. And loneliness causes emotional distress, where you look more at depression and suicidal thoughts and some of these other tendencies that you might have. But then you have shyness. You have people that, don't always like to talk in front of big audiences, or maybe afraid to read in public or do certain things in public or hold a position. It's because they don't have a social response at all. So they withdraw and avoid contact. You see it with kids. Kids are shy. They hug behind their parents, hold their legs, because when people speak to them, they kind of slide away from them because it's a learning process. And 40% of most people in the United States suffer from some form of shyness. So this is not a irrational phenomena. This is not an unknown phenomena. This is not a rare breed type of occurrence. It is very popular. It is very prevalent, in our society. And then last but not least, you have people who have social phobias. And these are people who are just flat out afraid of social interaction. And 7% of people in the United States suffer from this form of anxiety, where almost like how you have xenophobes who don't like foreign people, or you might have people that are allergic, arachnophobia, scared of spiders, or scared of heights, or scared of tight places. It's that same type of phobia where it becomes more of a mental component to how do you try to alleviate these mental pains but yet still have yourself in a place where you can achieve. And then you have your spiritual health. These are your spiritual activities that boost your life expectation. It helps you identify what your basic purpose is in life. It gives you that calmness. It gives you that inner peace. It gives you that self-awareness and well-being to know that, yeah, things may be rough, but it's going to be okay. And so when we look at this spirituality, we're looking at this belief in a higher power, that belief in God. Depending on your religion, that name of God may have a different name. It may be Krishna for some. It may be Buddha for others. It may be Allah for some. God for our Christians. But regardless of it, that spirituality is what ties you to give you some of that calm and peace, and gives you also a moral compass, an ethical, position, and also a value system. And so, and the more important thing is, it gives your life purpose. And so that led me to that last Q that we were talking about. We talked about that IQ earlier. We talked about an EQ. I call it an SQ. What is your spiritual intelligence quotient? What is your capacity to tap into this higher power, to tap into the higher, parts of yourself? But more than just a quotient to measure, but it's discovering wisdom. And discovering wisdom that comes out as a part of that inner self. And so there are three things that come from this. One, a value system. You understand more the consequences of choice. To know that, relatively like the law of thermodynamics, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. There is a consequence, for every choice, that we make. But that value system also gives us options from which we can choose. Do we want to go left or right? Do we want to choose blue or red? Do we want to choose, stripes versus plaids? It's a public affirmation of our value system. By that belief in this higher power, we believe and ascribe that we are called to do and be more. And then because of that, we also act out that value system. Similar to what your parents, the do as I say, not as I do. No, this is, I'm going to tell you and then I will show you what I do, as a part of this value system. Having that spiritual intelligence also increases your spiritual life. Whether it be through meditation, whether it be through worship, whether it be through, personal reflections that you have in your mornings, whether it be attending church on a regular basis, whether it be enrolling in a theology class because you want to learn more about how God is like, or to find ways to tap into this spiritual power, that you have. For others, it is prayer. It is the power of prayer, that to pray and to leave these things out on the table, that it gives you a greater sense of relief, to know that, things will be okay. And so when we look at those things, it surpasses and transcends logic. Because a lot of times for spiritual health, it defies logic. It forces you to not think here about the scientific ramifications of how to discover a determinant to make sure that you have an approximate or some type of result. See how it gets very much heady. It gets too complicated and bogged down. That spiritual quotient transcends that computer thinking and it makes you see and look inside of your heart and your mind to say, is this really the right thing? And how do I feel now that I have become a part of it? And so these things begin to develop you. They begin to build you, and it begins to have that effect on your spiritual life. So the combination of all three of these issues is what drives us. It is what makes us, because that is the definition of health. And so once we look at those concepts and those issues, it gives us that direction in which we should go. And so this week, as you read through that chapter and you begin to read and study those concepts of spiritual health and physical health and social health, to see how all three of these things tie together, it begins to give you a different focus. It begins to give you a different mindset. It begins to give you a different purpose. And for some, they need all three parts. For some, they think they only need one or two of those pieces. But either way, we know that through the reading of this text, how important each one of those aspects are to our overall health. So I look forward to your discussions about what we're going to do this week. I'm very curious to see what your thoughts, are going to be. And so I look forward to reading those. Thanks for watching this video for a small piece of your lecture to augment, what you're going to do this week. And I look forward to talking to you next week.